In the autumn of 2011, a man named Arthur Hemlock sent an invoice for $47,281.50 to the corporate headquarters of Precision Prefab, LLC. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper stock, the kind you have to special order. It was addressed by hand in a steady architectural script. The invoice inside had a single line item, printed from an old dot matrix printer. It read, "Storage, sorting and curation of raw materials, November 2000 to October 2011. The accounts payable clerk, a woman named Sharon, who had worked there for 3 years, thought it was a joke. The regional operations manager, Mark Jennings, who had been on the job for only 6 months, laughed out loud when she showed it to him. He shouldn't have. To understand the invoice and the silence that followed the laughter, you have to understand the fence and the 11 years that came before. Let me tell you about the fence, because it's where the story begins. It was 1,240 feet of 4-foot-high chain link installed in the spring of 1999 when the industrial park first broke ground. On one side of the fence was Lot 7, a 14.6-acre parcel of graded, compacted earth where Precision Prefab would soon build its 80,000-square-foot facility for manufacturing engineered wood products. On the other side was Arthur Hemlock. Arthur was 61 years old that spring, a cabinet maker who had taken over his father's workshop, which sat on 3.2 acres of land that his grandfather had bought for $800 in 1922. The land was long and narrow, and the new chain-link fence ran the entire length of its western border. For 77 years, that border had been nothing but a line of wild cherry trees and blackberry brambles. Now, it was a hard, clean, industrial edge. Arthur Hemlock was a man defined by inherited practices. He was known in the small town of Oak Haven for 2 things: the quiet, almost severe quality of his dovetail joints, and the fact that he never threw anything away. Not a bent nail, not a stripped screw, not a sliver of wood longer than his thumb. In his workshop, coffee cans full of hardware were lined up on shelves, their contents described on masking tape labels in the same script that would one day appear on the invoice. This was not a quirk, it was a philosophy. His father, Thomas Hemlock, had taught him that waste was not a category of material. It was a failure of imagination. Thomas had learned that from his father, who had built his house and barn with wood salvaged from a collapsed mill after the Great Flood of 1913. The Hemlock way was to see potential where others saw refuse. So when the factory went up and the trucks started rolling, Arthur watched. He did not complain about the noise or the dust. He just watched the fence. The factory, Precision Prefab, was a marvel of modern efficiency. They took in massive shipments of high-grade lumber, kiln-dried Douglas fir from Oregon, southern yellow pine from Georgia, laminated veneer stock from Quebec. They fed these perfect materials into computer numerical controlled saws and presses that spat out immaculate architectural trusses and beams with a tolerance of 1/16 of an inch. But this precision created a specific kind of byproduct. It created offcuts, thousands of them. These were pieces of perfectly good, high-grade, kiln-dried wood, ranging from 6 inches to 4 feet long. They were the fractional leftovers from cutting 24-foot beams down to a customer's 23-foot 7-inch specification. To the factory's automated systems, they were useless. They were too small to be fed back into the machines and too varied to be bundled and resold in bulk. On the balance sheet, they were categorized as process-generated waste. The cost to dispose of them was $1,500 a month, paid to an industrial hauling company. For the first year, Arthur watched a large yellow dumpster fill up with these offcuts every 2 days. He saw pristine lengths of 2x10 Douglas fir, blocks of laminated maple, and sheets of void-free Baltic birch plywood being carted off to the county landfill. It offended him in a way that was deeper than thought. It was a violation of a core principle, like watching a man use a chisel as a screwdriver. One day in November of 2000, he walked over to the factory's loading dock. The shift foreman, a man named Bill Peterson, who was 55 and had a bad knee, was overseeing the dumping. Arthur, in his canvas work coat and worn leather gloves, approached him slowly. He didn't say much. He just pointed at a flawless 3-foot piece of fir. "Can I have that for my wood stove?" Bill, who had to sign the disposal manifests and knew the cost, looked at Arthur, then at the dumpster, then back at Arthur. He shrugged. "Take what you want, old man. It's all going to the dump. Just don't get in the way of the forklift." That was the agreement. It was never written down. It was a conversation of fewer than 20 words between two men of a certain generation, grounded in a shared, unspoken practicality. The next day, Bill told his forklift operator to just dump the offcut bin over the fence at the back corner of Arthur's property. It was easier for them. It saved a trip to the main dumpster, and Arthur could pick through it at his leisure. It saved the company a marginal amount of dumpster space, which meant a marginal amount of money, and it solved a problem for Arthur. It was an elegant, simple, handshake solution. For 11 years, 2 or 3 times a week, a forklift would rumble to the back of the lot, hoist a 4 cubic yard steel bin, and tip a cascade of wooden scraps over the chain-link fence. The sound of it, a clatter and boom of falling timber, became part of the rhythm of Arthur Hemlock's life. Let me tell you about the pile, because it wasn't a pile. To anyone driving past on the county road, it looked like a mountain of junk, a messy testament to an old man's hoarding. His grandson, David, who was 11 when it started and 22 when it ended, was deeply embarrassed by it. He called it Grandpa's trash heap. But Arthur never saw a pile. He saw an inventory. He saw a resource waiting for a purpose. And he didn't just let the wood sit there. He worked on it. Every evening after finishing in his workshop, he would spend an hour at the fence line. He wore the same leather gloves his father had worn, the palms darkened with 40 years of oil and sweat. He sorted. This sorting was a ritual, a form of active meditation. He separated the wood by species, the reddish tint of the Douglas fir, the pale cream of the maple, the heavy, open grain of the oak that showed up once in a while. He sorted by dimension, creating smaller, specific stacks of 2x4s, 2x6s, 4x4s. He sorted by quality, examining each piece for knots, splits, or milling defects. Anything with a structural flaw went into the firewood pile, which was neat and cross-hatched and stood exactly 6 feet high. The good wood, the clear-grained, perfectly dimensioned heart of the factory's waste, was treated with reverence. He scraped the dirt and gravel off each piece, he measured it, and then he stacked it. The stacking was a technique passed down from his grandfather. It was called stickering. He laid down a foundation of heavy timbers to keep the wood off the damp ground. Then he would lay down a course of boards, and on top of them he would place small, uniformly sized blocks of wood, the stickers. then another course of boards, then another set of stickers. The method created a gap of about 1 inch between each layer of wood, allowing air to circulate freely around every single piece. This was crucial. Wood needs to breathe. It needs to acclimate to the local humidity, to settle, to release the internal stresses from its milling. The factory's wood was kiln-dried, but Arthur knew that was only half the process. True stability, the kind you need for fine furniture that won't warp or crack, comes from patience and air. His stacks were beautiful geometric structures hidden behind the messy face of the initial heap. They were libraries of lumber, catalogued by species, dimension, and date of arrival. In a small, weather-beaten notebook, he recorded the estimated board feet of each load. It wasn't a hoarder, it was a curator. For the first few years, he used the wood for small projects. He built new cold frames for his wife's garden out of cedar offcuts. He built a heavy, indestructible workbench for his own shop from laminated maple beams that were 18 inches too short for a construction job in Cleveland. He repaired a neighbor's porch steps for free. He was simply putting the wood to its proper use, honoring the material. But the loads kept coming. The factory was successful, expanding its operations in 2004. The pile, and Arthur's stickered stacks behind it, grew. It grew from a mound into a ridge. By 2005, he had accumulated an estimated 10,000 board feet of prime lumber. A commercial supplier would have charged nearly $20,000 for that quantity of material. To Arthur, its value was not in dollars, but in potential. That year, he took on his first major project. The small shed where he seasoned his personal stock of walnut and cherry was rotting. He decided to build a new one. He drew up the plans by hand on graph paper at his kitchen table. The shed would be 12 feet by 24 feet, with a gambrel roof to maximize storage in the loft. He would build it entirely from the factory's cast-offs. He laid a foundation of concrete blocks he'd salvaged from another site years earlier. He framed the walls with 2x6 Douglas fir. He sheathed them in 3/4-inch plywood scraps he painstakingly squared and fit together like a puzzle. The roof trusses, the most complex part, he built on the floor of his workshop, using the same engineering principles as the factory next door, but executing them with a handsaw and a framing square. It took him all summer. His grandson David, now 17, would sometimes help, mostly out of a sense of duty. "Why don't you just buy the lumber, Grandpa? It would be so much faster." Arthur would just shake his head and hand the boy a hammer. "Faster is not the point," he'd say. "Better is the point." The shed was a quiet masterpiece. The joints were tight. The roof was perfectly pitched. From the outside, it was unassuming, but inside it smelled of pine and potential. He moved his personal lumber into it, and then he kept building. The stacks of stickered wood from the fence line now had a place to be stored out of the rain. The process became a system. Wood was dumped at the fence. He sorted it. The firewood went to the wood pile. The good wood was stickered and left to season for a year. Then it was moved into the new shed. The factory next door was a river of high-grade lumber, and Arthur Hemlock had built a diversion channel and a reservoir. By 2008, the first shed was full. He started building a second, larger structure. This one was more ambitious, 30 feet by 50 feet, a proper barn. It took him 2 years. He had to buy the metal roofing, but every single piece of wood, from the massive 6x6 posts that formed the frame to the 1x8 boards he used for the siding, came from the fence. He designed it with a large open central bay and 2 side wings for storage. He ran electricity to it from his main shop. David, now in college studying business, saw it as the world's most overbuilt storage unit for a pile of trash. He loved his grandfather, but he saw his obsession with the wood as a symptom of a bygone era, an irrational refusal to accept the simple economic logic of the modern world. You could make more money in an hour working at the mall than you save messing with this stuff for a week, he'd argue. Arthur would be planing a piece of fur, the shavings curling up in fragrant ribbons. He'd hold the board up to the light, checking for flatness. He'd say, "You're confusing price with value, son. They aren't the same thing." In the spring of 2011, everything changed. Precision Prefab was acquired by a larger national conglomerate. The old plant manager, who had approved the handshake deal 11 years earlier, retired. The new ownership sent in a man named Mark Jennings. Mark was 34 years old, had an MBA from Penn State, and was a certified Lean Six Sigma black belt. His entire professional identity was built on the science of optimization. He walked the factory floor with a tablet and a stopwatch, looking for inefficiencies, for waste, for any process that was not documented, audited, and justified by a cost-benefit analysis. He found one on his third day. He saw the forklift driver, a new kid, take a bin of offcuts not to the main dumpster, but to the back fence. "What is that?" he asked the shift foreman. The foreman, a man who had replaced Bill Peterson, just shrugged. "Oh, that's just the deal we have with the old guy next door. We dump the scraps, he cleans it up." Mark Jennings did not like deals. He liked contracts. He did not like the old guy next door. He liked adjacent property stakeholders. He pulled the property records for Arthur's land. He pulled the company's waste disposal invoices for the last 5 years. He saw the $1,500 per month fee. He saw the satellite image of the pile on Arthur's property. His mind, trained in the art of turning every situation into a set of quantifiable variables, saw a problem and an opportunity. The problem was liability. What if the old guy got hurt? What if he claimed the wood was toxic? It was an undocumented, uninsured, inefficient process. The opportunity was monetization. They were giving away a resource, even if it was a waste resource, for free. He walked over to Arthur's property one Tuesday afternoon. He wore a crisp blue button-down shirt, no tie, and expensive-looking work boots that had never seen a day of real work. Arthur was in his workshop sharpening the blade of a hand plane. It was a Stanley Bailey No. 7 jointer plane made in the 1920s. It had been his grandfather's. It was heavy, 1.5 feet long, and in Arthur's hands it could shave a piece of wood to 1/1000th of an inch. Mark Jennings knocked on the doorframe. "Arthur Hemlock?" he asked. Arthur looked up, slowly. He finished tightening the screw on the plane's cap iron before he acknowledged the man. "Yes, I'm Mark Jennings, the new operations manager at Precision." He gestured vaguely toward the factory. Arthur nodded, his face impassive. Jennings got straight to the point. "I've been reviewing our disposal procedures, and it looks like we've had an informal arrangement concerning our wood offcuts. I'm here to formalize it. For legal and efficiency reasons, we can't continue the current practice, but I have a proposal. We're prepared to offer you a lease agreement. We'll pay you $100 a month to use that back corner of your property as a designated debris staging area. We'll handle all the material. All you have to do is cash the check." He smiled, a confident, professional smile. It was a good deal. He was turning a liability into a revenue stream for the old man. He was solving a problem. Arthur placed the heavy plane on his workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at Mark Jennings. "The wood isn't debris," he said. "It's lumber." Jennings's smile tightened. "Mr. Hemlock, with all due respect, it's waste product. My company pays to have it hauled to a landfill. I'm offering you $1,200 a year to let us put it on your land. It's a win-win." Arthur looked past Jennings, toward the two large sheds he had built. He thought of the thousands of hours he had spent sorting, stacking, and stickering. He thought of the material, the clear-grained Douglas fir and southern pine, now resting and ready in those buildings. "No," he said. The quiet finality in that single word took Mark Jennings by surprise. He was used to negotiation, to counter-offers. He was not used to a simple, unadorned refusal. He tried a different tack. "Look, I can't keep an undocumented process in place. My auditors would have a field day. So, here's the reality. Either we sign a formal agreement or I have to stop the deliveries. I will contract with our disposal company to place a dedicated roll-off dumpster on our property. It will cost me $1,500 a month, but it's a clean, auditable solution. It's the cost of doing business. The deliveries to your property will cease, effective in 30 days. And, Mr. Hemlock, that existing pile? It's a safety hazard and a potential environmental issue. You'll need to have it cleared. The town has ordinances about this sort of thing." He wasn't trying to be malicious. He was simply stating the facts as his world understood them. He was a man of systems, and this was how systems worked. Arthur picked up the hand plane again, testing the edge with his thumb. He looked at the young man in the doorway. He said, "You do what you have to do." The news hit David, the grandson, like a physical blow. He came home from his community college classes that evening to find his grandfather in the kitchen, oiling the rosewood handle of the old plane. "Did you hear? A guy from the factory came by. He's going to stop dumping the wood." Arthur nodded. "I know. I spoke to him." David threw his hands up. "And you just let him? Grandpa, that's free firewood for life. Why didn't you take his deal? $100 a month for nothing." "It wasn't for nothing," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "He was offering to pay me to store his trash. I'm not a junkyard." "But it's not trash. It's what you've been using for 10 years. David's voice was filled with the frustration of a generation that saw a straight line where his grandfather saw a complex landscape. "You're letting your pride get in the way of a good deal. Now we get nothing. And what about that pile? He said we have to clean it up. Do you know how long that will take? We'll have to rent a chipper. It'll cost a fortune." Arthur finished his work on the plane. He set it down gently on a clean cloth. He looked at his grandson, a boy he had taught to ride a bike and bait a hook, a boy who now saw the world through the lens of a spreadsheet. "The wood has a purpose, David. It's not done yet. Just be patient." Patience was not a virtue in Mark Jennings' world. Efficiency was. Action was. He sent a certified letter to Arthur Hemlock the next day. It was a formal notice drafted by the company's lawyers. It stated that Precision Prefab LLC would be terminating its informal material disposal practice in 30 days, on October 31st, 2011. It further stated that the accumulated debris on Mr. Hemlock's property constituted a violation of Local Ordinance 114B, uncontrolled accumulation of solid waste, and that if it was not fully remediated by that date, The company would be forced to notify the town code enforcement office. The letter was cold, legal, and absolute. The story spread through Oakhaven. The pile had been a landmark for a decade. People had opinions. Some thought Arthur was a crazy old hoarder who was finally getting his comeuppance. Others saw him as a local character being pushed around by a faceless corporation. The town council held an informal meeting. The code enforcement officer, a man who had known Arthur for 30 years, drove by the property slowly, but didn't stop. The clock was ticking. Mark Jennings, from his office window, could see the pile. He saw no activity. The old man was going to ignore the letter, he thought. He was going to call his bluff. Jennings sighed. He didn't want to be the bad guy, but a system was a system. He made a note in his calendar for November 1st. Call Town Code Enforcement re Hemlock property. Inside the Hemlock property there was a great deal of activity, but it wasn't the kind Mark Jennings could see. It was happening inside the new barn, the 30 by 50-foot structure built from the factory's own wood. For the past year, Arthur had been quietly acquiring old machinery. He had bought a 1950s-era Delta table saw with a 5-horsepower motor at a farm auction for $300. He had found a massive 24-inch jointer from a high school wood shop that was closing down, paying $500 for a machine that would cost $15,000 new. He bought a bandsaw, a drill press, and a dust collection system. He paid in cash, hauling the heavy cast-iron machines home on a borrowed trailer. He had spent the last 6 months restoring them, tuning them, and wiring them. He was not clearing the pile. He was preparing for it. In the final week of October, he started. David, convinced his grandfather had finally lost his mind, refused to help. So Arthur hired a young man from down the road, paying him $15 an hour. They started not at the messy front of the pile, but at the back, where the oldest, most seasoned stacks of stickered lumber stood. They didn't use a chipper, they used a wheelbarrow. They carefully unstacked the wood piece by piece and moved it into the new barn. Arthur directed the placement of each stack, leaving clear aisles for the new machines. The messy, chaotic-looking pile was a facade. Behind it, for more than a decade, Arthur had been cultivating an orderly, accessible, and now mature inventory of raw material. He was not cleaning up a dump. He was moving his assets indoors. On October 31st, the final day, the work was done. The vast, sprawling pile that had defined the fence line for 11 years was gone. In its place was a neat, bare patch of ground, but the 2 sheds, and especially the large new barn, were now filled to the rafters with meticulously organized lumber. Mark Jennings saw the clear ground from his window and felt a sense of relief. The old man had complied. It was a clean, efficient outcome. He had avoided a messy confrontation. He felt a small measure of professional satisfaction. At 9 a.m. on November 1st, Mark Jennings was in a meeting when his secretary told him Arthur Hemlock was here to see him. Jennings was surprised. He walked out to the reception area. Arthur was standing there, holding not a complaint, but a single thick cream-colored envelope. He was wearing his clean work clothes. He handed the envelope to Jennings. "I believe this is in order," he said. Jennings, confused, opened it. Inside was the invoice, one line item: storage, sorting and curation of raw materials, November 2000 to October 2011. And the total, $47,281.50. This is when Mark Jennings laughed, a short, sharp, incredulous bark. "What is this? A joke?" It's not a joke, Arthur said. His voice was perfectly level. You said the wood was waste, that it cost you $1,500 a month to dispose of. That's $18,000 a year. Over 11 years, that's a cost of $198,000 to your company. I saved you that money. I took your waste product and I stored it. I cared for it. I kept it from the landfill. I am charging you less than 25% of the money I saved you. I think that's fair. Jennings's face went from amused to angry. This is extortion. We had a verbal agreement. We'd let you take the wood for free. You are correct, Arthur said. We had an agreement that I could use the wood, and I have. He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small hand-carved key. He held it out to Jennings. I'd like you to come and see how I've used it. David, who had followed his grandfather, convinced he would have to apologize for his senile behavior, stood by the door, his face pale. Mark Jennings, against his better judgment, followed. He was a man who believed in data, in seeing things for himself. He followed Arthur across the parking lot, through the gate, and onto the 3.2 acres of hemlock land. They walked past the house, past the old workshop. They walked to the large new barn. Arthur stopped in front of the two massive sliding doors. On the front of the barn, a new sign had been hung. It was made from a single beautiful piece of laminated Douglas fir, 3 feet wide and 10 feet long. The letters were carved in a classic, powerful font. It read, Hemlock & Son, Custom Millwork. Arthur used the key to unlock the small side door. He swung it open and gestured for Jennings to enter. Jennings stepped inside, and his breath caught. The light from the high windows illuminated a space that was not a storage shed, but a fully equipped, professional woodworking mill. The old restored machines stood like iron sculptures on the clean concrete floor. To the left and right, filling the side wings, were the stacks of wood. Not a chaotic pile, but a perfectly organized lumber yard. Douglas fir, southern pine, maple, oak. Thousands upon thousands of board feet of it, sorted by dimension, seasoned by time, and ready for use. It was an inventory that would be the envy of any custom furniture maker in the state. An inventory built entirely from his factory's garbage. David stepped in behind Jennings, his mouth agape. He was seeing it all for the first time. The scale of it, the order, the sheer, undeniable value. The trash heap his grandfather had been tending his entire life wasn't a sign of senility. It was the foundation of a business with his name on it. Arthur walked over to his old notebook, the one where he'd logged the wood deliveries. He had it open to a page of calculations. I estimated the board footage of every delivery, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the big room. I used your company's own annual reports to find the market price you paid for your raw lumber stock. I discounted it by 50% to account for the smaller dimensions. The number on that invoice is my cost for storing and curating your raw materials, which you delivered to my property for 11 years. You saw it as waste disposal. I saw it as inventory financing. Now, you can pay the invoice, or we can find another arrangement. Mark Jennings stood in the center of the room, surrounded by tens of thousands of dollars of what his spreadsheets had called waste. He looked at the invoice in his hand. He looked at the machinery. He looked at the endless stacks of wood. He was a man who understood numbers. He had threatened Arthur with a $1,500 a month disposal cost. That was his leverage. Now, Arthur was presenting him with a bill for $47,281.50, backed by a physical inventory that was likely worth twice that on the open market. Arthur had taken his own logic, the logic of quantifiable assets and liabilities, and turned it back on him. The legal fight would be a nightmare. The public relations story, a massive company suing a 72-year-old craftsman for cleaning up their mess, would be a disaster. He had walked in with all the power of a corporation behind him. He was walking out with nothing but a bad set of options. He didn't pay the invoice, not all of it. The lawyers got involved, of course. There were meetings. But Arthur Hemlock, with David now by his side, didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just sat in the conference room at the factory, his calloused hands resting on the polished table, and waited. He had the wood. He had the time. He had waited 11 years. He could wait a few more weeks. They settled. Precision Prefab paid Arthur $15,000 and signed a 10-year contract. Under the terms of the contract, the factory would sell all of its offcuts to Hemlock & Son Custom Millwork for a price of 10 cents on the dollar of its original cost. The factory turned a disposal liability into a small revenue stream. It was an efficient, documented, auditable solution. Mark Jennings was able to frame it as a win on his report. But the real winner was Arthur. He had secured a permanent, inexpensive supply of high-grade raw material. The mill, which had been a quiet dream, became a loud reality. The sound of the big table saw ripping through a fir beam replaced the sound of the forklift dumping wood over the fence. David never went back to college. He became his grandfather's apprentice and then his partner. He learned to read the grain of a board, to sharpen a plane blade until it could shave the hair on his arm, to see the potential in a piece of wood that someone else had thrown away. He learned the difference between price and value. Arthur Hemlock worked in the mill for another 8 years. He died at the age of 80, quietly, in his sleep. He left the house, the 3.2 acres of land, and the thriving business to his grandson. David runs it to this day. They have 3 employees. They build custom furniture, architectural moldings, and high-end cabinetry for clients all over the state. They are known for the quality of their materials and the precision of their work. On the wall of the office, framed, is a copy of the original invoice for $47,281.50. What a company calls waste is often just a resource seen without patience. The economy of the spreadsheet is good at measuring cost, but it is terrible at measuring worth. It sees a pile of scrap and calculates the price of disposal. It cannot see a workshop, a business, an inheritance. It cannot see the slow, silent, accumulating power of a man who knows that nothing is worthless if you have the skill to use it and the time to wait. Waste, Thomas Hemlock taught his son, and his son taught his grandson, is just a failure of imagination. And imagination, unlike lumber, is a resource you can never run out of.